Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources Facebook Live session for this afternoon on, what is it, December 18th. It's a nice cozy day where I am. It's cold and rainy, and I hope all of you are doing well. We're going to dig into a topic that maybe will heat us up called prescribed fire, and I'm joined by two incredible colleagues. My name is Yana Valachovic, and I work in the North Coast in a whole host of issues, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So I'd like to introduce my two very inspiring colleagues who've spent much of the last decade working in prescribed fire, who are going to help us understand more about the why and the how and the where, and give us some ideas about how we might incorporate this tool in our own land management practices, and or just learn more about kind of why we might be using this tool in other landscapes. So Lenya Quinn-Davidson is an area fire advisor. She works at many scales, locally in the North Coast, across the state, and really across the nation, and works in training opportunities and in policy, and really helping us think about how we can better utilize the prescribed fire tool. So if I would say hi, Lenya.
Thanks, Yana. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And then my other colleague, Susie Kocher, she is coming in from Lake Tahoe and is a forester and has many years of working with landowners in a whole variety of forest health issues and tree management issues and managing dead trees and live trees, and really trying to figure out how we live in this forested ecosystem. So thank you for joining us, Susie.
Thanks, Yana. Thanks for having us.
You bet. And I realized I just looked at the November calendar, so it's actually December 15th. So, well, there we go. So we hope we don't have any more tech challenges aside from my inability to read the date. But with that, we've got, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes or so of some background presentation to kind of frame the conversation, get us thinking about the issues. And we really want to welcome your questions and your dialogue and your conversation. And after Lenya and Susie kick it off, then we're going to have some conversation, and hope you can join in that by putting your questions in the chat, and we'll kind of see where it goes. Oh, and is a forester and has many years of workation, and hope you can join in that by putting your questions in the chat, and we'll kind of see where it goes. Oh, and is a forester and has many years of workation, and hope you can join in that by putting your questions in the chat, and we'll kind of see where it goes. Oh, and is a forester and today. All right. I just want to thank and appreciate Dora Garay, who's working behind the scenes to make all these tech pieces work.
And that's enough about me. So there you go.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, Yana, if that sounds good to you.
Perfect.
And the format we're going to use is I'm going to share a little bit, and then we'll jump over to Susie. And yeah, I figure, Yana, with your mistake on the calendar, you're just trying to get closer to vacation, you know? So I was wishful thinking that if it's December 18th, then we'll be even closer to vacation. So anyway, it's great to be here with you all talking about fire on this very cold and stormy day. I am up in Arcata, where it is blustery and freezing cold, but not snowing like it is in the rest of the state. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all. And, you know, when we decided to do this presentation, we wanted to keep it high level. We don't know who's in the audience, but we're assuming that there are some folks out there who aren't very familiar with prescribed fire. So we wanted to talk a little bit, you know, about prescribed fire in California. What is it? Where are we using it? How are we using it? And I think one of the important things for us all to remember is just how fire adapted California is. You know, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Stephen Pine, who's a fire historian, but in one of his recent books, he talks about 54% of California's landscapes are fire dependent, meaning they actually need fire in order to persist. And most of the rest of our landscape is fire adapted, meaning that, you know, those habitats have features that allow them to survive and thrive with fire. And I share here some photos that I've taken over the years, but these are some of my favorite landscapes, you know, ponderosa pine forests, coastal rangeland, oak woodlands, and these are all super connected to fire and to the history of fire, and in large part to people using fire. So we have, a very deep history of indigenous burning in California. In more recent history, we have a lot of ranchers and landowners using fire. And in the most recent history, we have agencies getting involved in that. But California is just so tied to fire, and most of the places that we really care about have a connection. So when we're using prescribed fire, we're not just using it to reduce fuels and prevent wildfire. That's kind of the thing that gets a lot of attention, is more prescribed fire equals less wildfire. And I'm here to say that that's actually really not the goal. The goal of prescribed fire, or using fire as a tool, is to restore fire as a process on this fire adapted landscape, and to reduce fuels, and to protect communities, and to increase biodiversity, and do all these different things. But it's really not just about fuels reduction. There's a lot more to it. And I wanted to share some photos and some storytelling from Humboldt County, where I live. But I think a lot of the reasons that we use prescribed fire in Humboldt County are the same in other parts of the state, and really focused on that role of fire and restoring fire as a process, because we know it's so vital for us living with fire in California in the future. So here are some photos from some prescribed burning projects that we've had in Humboldt County over the years. We do some fuels reduction projects, and we know that prescribed fire, when we put fire on the landscape under the right conditions, we can actually increase the resilience of forests to drought and to future wildfire. And Susie's going to dive in a little deeper on using prescribed fire in mixed conifer forests. We also know that Native people have a really rich history with using fire, and are really the originators of prescribed fire through cultural burning. And so up here in Humboldt County, we have some really fantastic leaders from the cultural burning community who are using fire for all different kinds of reasons, connected to their traditional ecological knowledge and to their, really the sustaining their culture. And so that's a really important part of the prescribed fire community as well. We also use prescribed fire a lot for oak woodland restoration. And this is one of my favorite uses of prescribed fire. We can go out into these areas, these beautiful oak woodlands, and here in Humboldt County, it's white oak and California black oak, but we're able to use fire to prevent things like conifer encroachment, where conifers are out competing these oaks and actually killing these oaks in the absence of that frequent disturbance. So prescribed fire is a really great way that we can restore that natural process, and also maintain our oak woodlands that we care so much about, and that are also so deeply connected to the biodiversity in the state of California. Oak woodlands are one of our most valuable habitat types for wildlife and for people. And so really an important part of our prescribed fire program up here. We also can use prescribed fire for invasive species control. So a lot of the ranchers and people who are, really care about native grasses and things like that, we're able to use prescribed fire at specific times of year to manage star thistle, medusa head, barb goat grass. These are some of the worst weeds that we have invading our grasslands in California, and prescribed fire can be super effective at controlling those. So it's a really valuable tool in those habitats. And then here in Humboldt County and throughout the coastal parts of California, we can use prescribed fire to restore our prairies and grasslands, and really to keep them from being outcompeted by shrubs and other things that, again, encroach in the absence of that frequent disturbance that these landscapes evolved with. So that's another really important part of our program. But who's using fire? So who's using prescribed fire in California? I mentioned earlier that there's a rich history, a lot, indigenous burning for millennia, ranchers in more recent history, and then the agencies getting involved. Well, here in California now, we are at a point where we have a lot of different people using prescribed fire, and it looks really different depending on where you are and who you're working with. And we've really seen a diversification in the use of prescribed fire just over the last few years. So we have groups called prescribed burn associations and non-governmental organizations that are leading prescribed fire in their communities. We have cultural practitioners who are revitalizing their cultural practices. We have state agencies like CAL FIRE, federal agencies like the Park Service and the Forest Service. And we have ranching groups and range improvement associations down on the Central Coast. So there are a lot of different people using prescribed fire. And it looks different depending on who's out there. It's not always going to look the same. And that's really wonderful and important that we have all those different people engaged in this work. And I like to think of it as really a movement in California, what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot of community members and people who are tired of being scared of fire, of being evacuated, of worrying about their forests and their homes burning. These people are coming together and taking action and becoming part of this movement of prescribed fire. And it's been just so exciting to see this develop over the last couple of years. And so this is a map of community-based prescribed fire groups across the state of California. And a few years ago, this map was mostly blank. Mostly we were seeing just fire management agencies using prescribed fire. Now we're seeing this upwelling of interest and really just all these grassroots groups forming prescribed burn associations, range improvement associations, all over the state. And so if you're interested in that and you want to engage with something in your local area, check out this calpba.org website. Dora's going to post that in the chat. And this is a great way for you to connect with local efforts and get involved if that's something you're interested in. And I'll pass it over to Susie. She's going to kind of dive in a little more deeply into that, into the Sierra Forest. Susie?
Thanks. Thank you, Lenya. It's great to be on an event with you, because Lenya is really a catalyst for us all working on private lands to help pass the torch for new people to be involved in prescribed fire. I am a registered professional forester, and I do outreach and education with forest landowners, and forest landowners have become very concerned. A lot of them have lost a lot of forests to high severity wildfire, and they are very interested in taking up prescribed fire as a potential strategy or potential treatment to see if they can reduce their risk and increase their fire resilience. And so I know that you all know that we've been having extreme wildfire behavior, especially in the last few years. Climate is changing. We have more burn days, more high severity weather conditions. And we have very crowded forests in most cases. That picture on the right is of a tree cookie, or a cross section of a tree. And what you see is an arrow pointing at a scar. Every time a wildfire passed this tree, it was of low severity. And so the tree was able to heal over it. So these are great records that show us that before the era of fire suppression, how often fires actually went through the forest. And so where I live in South Lake Tahoe at the lake level, we think it's every 15 years. Down in the Ponderosa Pine Belt, it's every 5 to 8 years, and mixed conifer probably every 8 to 12 years. There was, for the most part, low severity fire where most of the trees survived. Although patches of high severity in some areas. It's just that the patches that we're getting are very large. Like some of the fires this season, we know the Dixie fire was over 1 million acres, almost 1 million acres. And so it's really becoming difficult to contain. So a lot of action is needed in the forest to reduce density. So let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of where I cut my Christmas tree this year. It's very crowded with an understory because there's no fire coming along and clearing out the understory and some of the fuels that accumulate over time. And this has led to a number of different impacts. Lenya mentioned some of them. We have lots of encroachment in oak woodlands, meadows, aspen areas, and shrub habitats. So if you're a forest landowner, what can you do? Let's go to the next slide. These are some of the pictures of different forest management practices of ways to reduce that forest density. Hand thinning, people taking chainsaws, cutting down trees. The machine on the right of that is a masticator that's used to mow down brush and reduce the fuel height and rearrange it so it doesn't burn as intensely. There's some trees being skidded out. There's on the next row, you can see goats grazing, and some of those techniques are really very helpful. Mechanical thinning in the center, there's a feller buncher that's taking out small trees. On the right, they're being chipped up into biomass to be taken to a biomass plant. On the bottom left, you see hand piling and burning, where a landowner has cut the trees and put them in piles and burn them. And then on the bottom, you see broadcast burning. So the entire bottom row would be considered to be prescribed fire as a tool. These are all great tools. Let's go to the next slide. Landowners I work with, however, find a lot of constraints on using them. Although they are great tools, some of the ownership sizes, it's difficult to be able to bring in heavy equipment if you have a small parcel size. There's cost sharing available, but there are a lot of planning and permitting steps needed. There's a whole shortage of registered professional foresters who are required to help you with some of these tasks. Contractors and wood products facilities we know have been disappearing. So these are awesome tools. I encourage people to use them. I try and help them use them, but I really do think that prescribed fire on a small landowner scale is really a tool that can be used, and that would be helpful for a lot of landowners. So there's not a lot of capacity out there right now. There's been a professionalization of prescribed fire, though obviously I agree exactly with what Lenya said about how there's a movement, and the number and types of people who are using fire is growing. But in the past, it was discouraged, even outlawed. It's still difficult to get clarity in permitting. And I think for private landowners who want to use it, one of the biggest issues probably is just the lack of opportunities for experience. So how can we actually get some experience so we feel comfortable using it in a forest land setting? And then I just wanted to say that, yeah, I think it's accessible. And if you're burning in the winter in a forested setting, it's pretty low risk and low cost. So that's one of the advantages of using it for forest management. Next slide. So how do we get more experience? One of the ways that we do is to band together, as Lenya was describing, and try and learn how to burn together. So I saw that you had Tuolumne County in yellow, Lenya, and I would like to say that it probably needs to be blue at this point, which means it's a functioning PBA. We started this summer, and we hosted a Zoom meeting for people in Tuolumne and Calaveras County. We had 40 people sign up, of people who were really interested in forming a prescribed burn association. We held a field trip in August to see areas that had been burned by the college, Columbia College, and we looked at their equipment. In November, we held a pile burn event, which we couldn't burn because there was a no burn day, but we checked out the unit and decided to go for it for a PBA broadcast burn in December. So we were able to host our first burn on December 4th. And that's the number of people who showed up. Next slide. So just have some pictures of the process and how it went. Planning for our burn took about 2 weeks. It was a landowner who had burned before, but never gone through this formal process of developing a burn plan and getting a permit from CAL FIRE. So we have a member who has quite a bit of experience. He wrote the burn plan. CAL FIRE came out and inspected the property and came back the same day with an LE7 permit, which allows for forest management burning. And then once we got that, then we got our air quality burn permit that allowed us to move forward. We chose a random date, and by luck, the random date worked out. So next slide. Here we are. In the upper left-hand corner there are the landowners, and they're hosting the briefing before the burn. They're letting us all know what the burn unit looks like, what the effects they are hoping to achieve are. And then on the right is the first lighting, and it's a ceremonial moment because it's grandma with daughters and granddaughters all getting started together. So teaching the next generation is a really important part. We went into igniting the unit. It was about 3 acres. You can see it's very close to the house. There were about 20 of us, so more than enough people to both ignite and stand around, make sure it doesn't go anywhere. In December, really that top layer of needles was dry, but underneath it's fairly wet. And so it's really unusual that it could get away from you. We had to abandon a couple sections of the burn unit because it just was a little too wet underneath. So I think contrary to how people think about it, like I'm scared I'm going to light a fire and it's going to get away. Typically in the conditions that we're burning, we have to work hard to get it to light and to carry. That's been my experience. Next page. And then here's my last slide. So here's the group that showed up. Then we had pizza and beer and talked about how it went. And then the landowners did do some monitoring of the location. So one big difference between a forest burn and a rangeland burn is there often are many places that have deep fuels like stumps that could have caught on fire and may continue to smolder and burn over time. So the landowners did go out and checked it out in the middle of the night for 2 or 3 days until the smoking stopped. But they were very happy with this outcome. It's very patchy. We got a lot of needles and sticks burned. And because of this help, they said that they burned 3 times as much as they would have on their own. And so it was a extension of their work for them, and then all the rest of us got experience. So I think this is a really great model of how we could all get more experience and feel more comfortable for burning and for managing high-risk forest lands. So that's it for me. Go ahead and stop the show.
Well, thanks everyone. That was a great primer, beautiful images, and just really excited to think about who's using this tool and how we might apply it. So I think we'll have some conversation for a bit. We welcome your questions through the chat, and I've got some stuff prepared, and we'll just see where this goes and see what feels right. You know, I know I'm also a registered professional forester, and I talk to lots of people, and there's this like, well, that's something for the professionals to do. That's scary. Why would you even think about getting involved in prescribed fire? How do you manage that sort of fear, anxiety piece? And at the same time, there's also this kind of intrigue. Oh, well, it must be a little dangerous. So what's that about too? Like, so how do you talk about it in that space where people are both attracted and repulsed sort of simultaneously and, and trying to figure it out?
Well, I think the kinds of things that that Susie just talked about are the best way to deal with that. To get people out on a burn, especially a mellow project. The winter burning is so lovely for that because it's really low risk, and you can just start to build that comfort and give people an opportunity to engage. I think part of our big fear of fire in California is not only the wildfires we have, but also our general disconnect with fire. People have been using fire in California forever, but we're in a period seen it or had any kind of interaction with it. So if we can open up those opportunities, that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Yana, I would say that I've had people at prescribed fire workshops. I've been doing a workshop series for the last 3 years, and people show up. We light some things on fire, and for a few minutes, they're completely alarmed because to them, fires always represent something dangerous. And then after about 15 minutes, they're bored. There it is. It's just moving around and it's burning. So it's really like a 15-minute time period. You stand there with 15 minutes and all of a sudden, oh yeah, of course, it's just a natural part of the forest after that. That's what I've experienced.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. When should people be thinking about prescribed fire? I mean, here we are on a soggy and snowy day, depending on where you are in California. Is this meant for a certain season? Do we do this when it's dry and in the summer, or do we do it some other time of year?
Well, I think there are opportunities throughout the year. And the important thing is that we need to be thinking about it year round, even on days like today when it's so wet and cold and it seems, fire's not the first thing on our minds, but we need to be thinking about the projects that we might be planning for next year. We need to be getting all of our permits in place, especially our air quality. You know, you can be working on all these different pieces, and that way, when the right conditions present themselves, you're ready to jump on the opportunity, because prescribed fire is all about weather conditions. And if you don't have all the pieces lined up, then you're going to miss your windows when they come about. So we always say every day is a burn day. And that doesn't mean you're out burning, but it means you're thinking about burning, you're getting ready for it, and that you're, you know, ready to jump on any opportunity when it comes about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I do think that winter burning is a real opportunity, because oftentimes you're out of permitting season, and so the burn can be less administratively difficult. There was a 3-week season in the Sierra where we had burning through permits, and then with the snow and rain, now no permits are required until May. And yet we often have a couple of week dry spell in the middle of the winter at higher elevations. And these are times we could be taking advantage of a burn window when we wouldn't traditionally have thought about it that way. And maybe Dora can put a link in the chat box to Rob York's winter burn video series, which is really great. And it shows and explains the advantages of winter burning and the kind of forest structure that supports it. So we encourage that. Absolutely.
And you're right. We often in California get a nice banana belt season of, it could be in December, could be in January, could be in February, and everything is kind of moistened up. So the grass may be starting to grow in a few locations, but it'll dry out for a couple of weeks, and that is a good window. You know, you hear prescribed fire, sometimes you see it shorthand as RX fire. Is there a doctor that writes a prescription? What is in that sort of planning element that, you know, it invokes the word prescribed? What does that mean?
Susie, I keep going first. Do you want to go first on this one?
I was happy to have you go first, but if you want me to, I would just say that I showed a picture of a prescription on one of my slides very briefly. And it's a specific set of conditions under which you feel that you want to carry out your burn in order to achieve your goals. So you prescribe conditions under which burning will help you get where you're trying to go. So that's a concrete answer. You could get a little more metaphysical though, because to many people, burning is medicine for the landscape. And so you really are giving it good medicine to improve its health.
Like that. Does it also mean that there are days when your prescription doesn't apply? You know, like, so you were talking about this workshop and that you planned it for a certain day. Are there things that would have adjusted it so that even though you've made that plan, you would have
Sure.
done something that day?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually were in a permitting season. So we had a permit that required us to check a CAL FIRE burn index. And our permit said if the burn index is above a certain number, which means that's higher risk, then you're not allowed to burn. So statutorily, yes, there are things like that. Also, I mean, there could be things that happen where people can't make it. Absolutely. If the weather changes and is not what you expected, you have to be nimble and go earlier, maybe the day before and sneak it in, or the couple days after, however that works.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I always tell people, you know, we think of lighting fires and we're worried to be out of control or be too hot, but often with prescribed fire, we tend to be burning on the cooler end of our prescription. And often you'll get out there and you do a test fire. So you put some fire on the ground to see how it's going to behave. And sometimes you say it's not going to meet our objectives because it's not burning hot enough. And we have been known to call off burns because it's not burning hot enough. So I think sometimes when people come out on their first prescribed burn and they see that kind of thing and like, wow, that was not what I was expecting, that we'd actually be wishing it were burning hotter. You know, it's just, that's one of those funny things, but that prescription is so important for for helping us meet our objectives.
Yeah, I would say that is what happened to us on December 4th. We had to burn one unit first because that was the sunnier unit and it would actually carry a fire, and the one we tried with first did not. So yeah, flexibility is key.
Right, right. Yeah, Lenya, what you just said reminded me of a time when I took a phone call of a very angry and concerned neighbor because you were doing a project in June and it seemed like it had to be a terrible time, and no matter what was going to happen, it was going to get away. And I think the answer was that it was almost so wet and the grass was still so green that it wouldn't burn. How do you talk with neighbors about these issues? Because, I might have this great idea, or Susie might have this great idea, but my neighbor is not on board. How do you work through that kind of shared risk and concern piece?
Well, again, I think including them in the planning, getting them out on a burn, maybe on a burn that's not anywhere near their house, so they can kind of understand what that looks like. And if they're not open to that, then just having an open conversation, letting them ask questions. That's what's worked for me. People tend to be more supportive of prescribed fire if they understand the reason behind it and what you're trying to accomplish. And so if people understand there's an ecological reason, or it's for community protection or whatever, they're much more likely to support it than just thinking you're out there doing some crazy project. I don't know if Susie has more to add there.
I was just going to add that playing with the toys is always an incentive. There's trailers people have developed, putting a drip torch into a doubter's hand so they get a chance to actually see how it works themselves. A lot of people are very turned on by hands-on learning. And so I think that's the best way. People feel it and can really absorb that knowledge.
Yeah.
So how much of California do you think is suitable for prescribed fire?
Go ahead, Lenya.
Well, I don't like to put numbers to things. I think that most of California needs fire in some way, and whether we're getting there with with prescribed fire, cultural burning, or with wildfire in places that are more remote and where we can't get in there and do prescribed treatments. Either way, we're going to see fire burning on our landscapes in California. So the nice thing about prescribed fire is we can choose where and when and how it burns. And I think it's really appropriate around communities or in forests or other, specific places where we really know that we want to restore fire. Those are the places we can focus on with prescribed fire, and then be building that resilience outward so that wildfire might begin to have a role in the larger landscape again, in the places where that's appropriate. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but we know that pre-European settlement, more than 4.5 million acres were burning in California every year. So the fire seasons we've been seeing in recent years are not acreage-wise outside of the historical norm. They are in the damage that they're causing and the severity at which they're burning, but that acreage is actually starting to get back to a kind of a more historical pattern.
Yeah, I would just add that to your question of where should we be doing it. When I showed different methods of forest management, a lot of them require road access and access by heavy equipment. Mm-hmm. And the actual proportion of the forested landscape that has that is actually kind of a small proportion, under a quarter or half of the forested landscape. And so there's huge areas of forest that you can't access to do mechanical work to increase the resilience. And so prescribed fire is like one of the only tools that you can use in those areas. So I think we need to be doing it in lots of places, lots of elevations all over, to try and reduce the forest density and reduce the risk. And we could be doing it right in WUI communities as well. Here in South Lake Tahoe and North Lake Tahoe, the North Lake Tahoe Fire Protection District has been burning right up to very expensive homes for the last 20 years. So I do think it's a tool that can be used all around California.
That's great to know. I mean, it seems a little risky at some level with those beautiful homes, but yet such the important area, because we know we need to manage the fuels right adjacent to people's homes, or else you'll have fire carried directly to those houses. How does it compare in cost? I mean, you've just said if you don't have the roads, fire might be your only tool that you can use in certain landscapes, but are there other types of ways at producing some of the effects that you might be looking at, and does fire bring some advantage in that space?
Yeah, there's definitely a cost effectiveness to prescribed fire. So it's known to be one of the most cost effective treatments out there. It depends on the scale at which you're using it and on who's doing those projects. So these prescribed burn associations that Susie and I are leading up around the state are mostly volunteer based. They're really about people managing their lands, and it's not expensive. If you have neighbors who can come and help you, if you have a community cache of equipment that you can borrow, you're looking at pretty low cost. We have some burns that are free, and it's just really about people's time. The agencies are a little different because they have paid staff and tend to heavily staff their burns and have lots of equipment, and maybe burn in more complex times of year where they need helicopters and things like that. So we see a lot of variation in the cost of a prescribed fire, but at its core, it's not an expensive tool.
Pizza and beer and some gas costs. That was it.
Yeah.
Pizza is always the currency, isn't it? Well, I don't know how long to take this conversation necessarily, but I think, Dora, maybe you can put some resources into the chat so people can see locations where they can learn more, meet some of the characters that are involved in this work. And, maybe the attendees here aren't themselves going to be the ones that are going to be using the tool, but maybe they want to share some of the information with other folks. Where do you recommend folks start? Like, what should be that first best resource if you're curious about this tool and want to either skeptical or just curious and want to learn more? What do you recommend?
Well, I do think that Cal PBA website is a great place to go look at some resources, get a feel for these different community groups that are out there. And then those videos that we were sharing earlier on are also really fabulous, just if you want to have more visual on it and see what this looks like. So I think those are great places to start.
I would also just send us to the ucanr.edu/fire website, which has a whole section on prescribed fire as a tool and lots of great basic information for people who have questions.
Okay, I've got one ringer question, and I'm gonna see if you take the bait, Susie. So one of the things that we talk about in California is really scaling up work, and that, Lenya mentioned that we, historically 4 million or so acres burned in California's landscape. And right now, one of the state goals is to get to 1 million acres of vegetation management a year. And you recently posted, well, how do we get to 1 million acres?
1 million landowners. Yeah, it was from one of the instructors in my workshop series. And I think that makes a lot of sense, although actually, since we burned 3 acres last time, it only would take 300,000 landowners, right? So I do think that there is the potential to scale if every individual landowner is doing some part of that, even if they're only burning half an acre around their house. That cumulative effort will add up and reduce risk.
Yeah. Great. We are collectively stronger together than we are individually. So, well, I want to thank you both for joining us today in this UCANR live session here on Facebook. It's a new medium for us, and so we welcome your feedback. Welcome to continue the conversation. Welcome to dive in deeper onto some other topics if our attendees have interest in that way. So with that, Dora, I want to thank you for running the back end. Thank you, Lenya, Quinn-Davidson, and Susie Kocher for your fabulous presentations and all the hard work that you do, and look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, that was fun.
We'll have to do it again.